Marcus, step away from the conveyor and keep your hands where I can see them.
What is this about?
For nearly 9 years, Marcus Reed worked behind the scenes of one of the busiest airports in the region. Trusted with unrestricted access to secure baggage corridors, he handled thousands of passenger belongings every single week. But investigators say a sophisticated luxury theft operation was quietly unfolding right inside the airport's restricted loading system.
6 designer bags disappeared off flight 882 this week. Every scan leads back to you.
You're accusing me over luggage tags?
I want a lawyer.
The overnight shift always arrived quietly at Hartsfield-style international terminals outside Atlanta, long before sunrise, when the main terminals were still dim and echoing with cleaning crews and distant aircraft landings. Marcus Reed was already inside the restricted operations zone. He had worked airport baggage handling for nearly 9 years. Most of that time was spent in the same rhythm, scanning, lifting, redirecting, and loading luggage onto conveyor systems that never really stopped moving. The system itself was layered and precise. Every bag passed through automated scanners, barcode checkpoints, and weight verification stations before being routed into secure loading corridors. Access to these corridors was controlled by employee badge authentication, with security doors logging every entry down to the second. Marcus understood all of it, not just how to move bags, but how the entire chain of custody worked. From the moment luggage left a passenger's hands at check-in, it entered a controlled network of conveyors, sorting arms, and restricted tunnels that only airport personnel could access. On paper, nothing was supposed to go missing. Inside the airport, Marcus was known as steady. Supervisors rarely had complaints about him. He showed up on time, stayed through double shifts when needed, and handled pressure during peak international arrivals without hesitation. Colleagues described him as quiet but dependable, someone who didn't create problems in a system that constantly generated them. But outside the fluorescent hum of the terminal, Marcus's situation was different. He was falling behind on bills, juggling overdue mortgage notices and credit obligations that kept stacking up. Like many airport workers in expensive metro regions, his income didn't stretch far enough to match the cost of living outside the city perimeter. Friends and coworkers saw a man who kept his composure, even when overtime shifts became necessary just to stay current. It was during one of these overnight rotations that the first incident was formally logged. A passenger arriving from Milan reported missing luggage at baggage claim. The case initially seemed routine. Airport staff assumed misrouting, a common issue when international transfers involved tight layovers and multiple handling points. But the report escalated when the passenger insisted that 3 designer handbags, valued at nearly $70,000, never arrived at any checkpoint, not even delayed. The claim triggered a basic internal review. Security logs showed the bags had entered the system correctly. They were scanned at intake, passed through automated sorting, and entered the outbound loading corridor assigned to Marcus's overnight crew. At first, no one treated it as suspicious. Airports deal with lost luggage constantly, and the assumption leaned toward system delay rather than theft. Then it happened again. Within weeks, a second report came in from a flight arriving from Paris, then another from Dubai, then Los Angeles. Each case involved high-value designer items, luxury handbags, limited edition accessories, items that were easily traceable in value and origin. Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Gucci, Hermes. The pattern was subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss individually. But when placed together in internal audit logs, something began to stand out. The missing items were not random. They were consistently disappearing at the same stage of processing. After scanning, after sorting, but before final loading confirmation into outbound cargo units. Airport management initially leaned toward external theft theories. Organized baggage theft rings were not unheard of. There were occasional reports of coordinated criminal groups exploiting airport transfers, especially in large international hubs where luggage moved quickly through multiple hands. The internal briefings focused on external vulnerabilities rather than internal breach. Supervisors issued reminders about vigilance, but avoided public acknowledgement. Any suggestion of internal failure carried legal and financial consequences, and the airport's administration was cautious about drawing attention to potential systemic weaknesses. Still, investigators reviewing internal logs began narrowing their focus. The access records showed that every affected shipment passed through the same restricted baggage corridor during overnight operations. The same corridor Marcus Reed was assigned to almost every shift. Badge logs confirmed his presence during each window of disappearance. Our surveillance coverage in that specific corridor was limited due to ongoing maintenance upgrades that had left several camera angles partially obstructed or intermittently offline. It wasn't unusual for airport infrastructure to have blind spots, but in hindsight, the timing aligned too precisely to ignore. Marcus himself never appeared outwardly different during those weeks. He continued his routine. Moving between conveyo Ocker stations, checking tags, guiding carts into loading positions. To supervisors walking the floor, nothing seemed out of place. He answered questions directly, kept his focus on tasks, and maintained the same quiet professionalism he always had. But internally, the system was beginning to shift around him. Quietly, slowly, without confrontation yet. Investigators still did not have enough to make a direct accusation. There was no confirmed footage of theft, no recovered items. Oh no, direct witness statement placing him in possession of missing luggage. Only patterns. Only timing. Only access. And in an airport system built entirely on trust, that was not yet enough to act. For now, management labeled the situation as an ongoing irregularity. A deeper review was authorized but kept internal. Additional audits were scheduled, but not publicized. Security teams were instructed to observe without alerting staff. Marcus continued working through it all. Still assigned to the same corridor, stint. Ale moving between the same conveyor lines where every missing shipment had passed. And as the next wave of overnight flights began arriving, investigators quietly extended their monitoring deeper into the system, unaware that the pattern they were seeing was only the surface of something far more coordinated than they initially believed. But investigators still had no idea how deep the theft operation inside the airport actually went. The internal audit didn't begin with suspicion. It began with paperwork. Stacks of delayed insurance claims had started piling up in the airport's risk management office. I tucked inside a low-lit administrative corridor on the second floor of the terminal complex. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of aging desktop monitors as compliance officers began reviewing what initially looked like routine baggage. Discrepancy reports. But within a few days, the volume became impossible to ignore. At the center of it was a growing inconsistency between baggage SCA, on logs, and final delivery confirmations. TSA compliance officers working alongside airport security analysts started pulling timestamp data from conveyor systems. Every bag had a digital footprint. Every movement was recorded through barcode scans, loading bay entries, and customs routing checkpoints. On paper, nothing should have disappeared without leaving a trace. But the traces were there, just not where they were expected. The first pattern emerged quietly. Luxury international flights were disproportionately affected. Routes arriving from Milan, Paris, Dubai, and occasionally Los Angeles showed repeated instances of missing high-value luggage. Economy passengers reported no issues. A standard baggage flow appeared intact, but premium cargo holds consistently showed gaps in final delivery reconciliation. As analysts layered scan data over staffing schedules, a second pattern appeared. Nearly every disappearance occurred during overnight shifts, specifically within narrow windows between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. when staffing levels were reduced and supervisory oversight was minimal. The airport relied heavily on rotating crews during these hours, and investigators noted that accountability protocols often weakened during shift transitions. The third pattern was even more concerning. Missing bags were not vanishing at random checkpoints. They were consistently disappearing between unloading and customs routing inside a specific segment of the baggage tunnel system that connected remote arrival gates to secondary sorting facilities. This corridor was partially shielded from direct surveillance due to maintenance upgrades that had left several camera units outdated or misaligned. When investigators overlaid access logs with these timestamps, the pattern tightened further. That was when Airport Logistics Supervisor Karen Whitmore entered the investigation more directly. Karen was a white operations manager with nearly 15 years in airport logistics. She was known for being detail-oriented, often reviewing scan discrepancies that others dismissed as system glitches. It was during a routine reconciliation audit that she noticed something unusual. Multiple luxury baggage tags were being scanned near an auxiliary, a storage corridor that was not part of the approved routing map. At first, she assumed a clerical routing error, but as she traced the logs backward, the same anomaly appeared again and again. Bags marked for international transfer were briefly appearing in unauthorized scan zones before their records went dark entirely. Karen escalated the issue to compliance officers, who initially treated it as a systems calibration problem. But she insisted the pattern was too consistent to be technical failure. Her report included printed scan logs, timestamps, and handwritten notes marking each irregular entry point. The documents sat on a conference table under the steady buzz of overhead lights, while senior staff debated whether further escalation would delay operations. Meanwhile, inside the baggage division, Marcus Reed continued his overnight shifts. Investigators first brought him in for informal questioning. It was under the pretense of routine verification. A small office near Terminal B, white walls, a single camera in the corner, and a metal table with scattered printouts of scan histories. Marcus sat calmly, hands resting on the edge of the table, responding with short, controlled answers. He didn't appear agitated. He didn't over-explain. He simply stated what he remembered about his shifts, his routes, and his assignments. Other employees, when questioned about increased inspections, reacted differently. Some became defensive, others visibly anxious, asking if there were accusations being made. But Marcus maintained a steady composure that investigators later noted as unusual, given the intensity of the scrutiny beginning to form around overnight operations. Still, at that stage, there was no direct evidence linking him to theft. Only access patterns, only timing correlations, only proximity. Internally, the airport's weaknesses became more difficult to ignore. Eye surveillance systems in key corridors were outdated, some cameras producing grainy footage with intermittent recording gaps. Overnight security staffing was stretched thin, often covering multiple zones with limited communication between posts. Internal accountability reviews had been delayed multiple times over the past year due to operational pressure and passenger throughput demands. Several employees had previously submitted maintenance reports warning that certain access doors in the baggage tunnels failed to lock consistently. Those complaints had been logged but not prioritized, marked instead for future infrastructure review due to budget constraints. As investigators continued narrowing their focus, Marcus's employee badge logs became increasingly significant. His access records showed repeated entries into loading corridors, outside of his assigned shifts. Not just once or twice, but across multiple nights that matched the timing of missing luxury baggage incidents. Still, access alone did not confirm removal of property, it only confirmed presence. The challenge for investigators was procedural. In a system built on shared responsibility, presence could not automatically equate to theft without corroborating surveillance or recovered goods. Our pressure began building within airport police leadership. Meetings were held late into the night inside a secured operations office, where monitors displayed fragmented scan data and incomplete camera feeds. The air carried the constant hum of ventilation systems, and the quiet clicking of keyboards as analysts tried to reconstruct movements that were never fully recorded. Eventually, after weeks of internal review and failed attempts to obtain direct confirmation, airport police obtained approval for covert surveillance inside the baggage tunnel system. The operation was classified internally, limited to a small investigative unit, and restricted under compliance oversight. Hidden cameras were installed along key loading corridors. Additional tracking devices were embedded into select high-value luggage shipments. Shift schedules were quietly adjusted to ensure coverage without alerting staff. No one inside the baggage division was informed. And as the first night of covert monitoring approached, investigators believed they were finally close to answering the question that had been lingering since the first missing luxury bags were reported. What investigators captured during those overnight surveillance operations changed the entire case. The covert surveillance operation began without announcement, buried inside a restricted coordination log under the airport's internal security division. On paper, it was labeled as a temporary monitoring enhancement initiative, but in practice, it was a full-scale investigative sweep spanning multiple terminals, cargo corridors and maintenance tunnels. By 11:47 p.m., the first surveillance feeds went live. In a dimly lit operations room near the airport's security command center, white federal analysts and airport compliance officers watched a grid of monitors flicker into real-time coverage. The air carried the low hum of ventilation systems and the occasional crackle of encrypted radio updates from field teams positioned in parking structures and service corridors. Every camera angle had been carefully selected, focused on baggage loading points, employee exits, and the narrow maintenance hallway connecting Terminal C's international arrivals wing to the central sorting hub. Marcus Reed was already on shift. At first, nothing appeared unusual. He moved through his assigned corridor with the same steady rhythm investigators had seen in prior footage. Scanning tags, guiding carts, checking manifests against conveyor outputs. But what investigators were now tracking went beyond routine movement. His badge activity was being cross-referenced in real time with hidden cameras placed in previously blind maintenance junctions. Around 12:18 a.m., the first anomaly appeared. A high-priority baggage cart from a Milan-bound flight entered the system. The manifest flagged several premium luggage items, including 2 designer-tagged hard cases marked for expedited customs processing. A surveillance showed Marcus briefly separating those cases from the main cluster during sorting, placing them on a secondary holding rack positioned closer to the maintenance corridor entrance. There was no immediate violation, not yet, but it was the first deviation from standard routing behavior. Inside the command room, a white TSA analyst leaned closer to the monitor, quietly marking the timestamp. No one spoke. The observation was logged but not yet interpreted as actionable. Minutes later, the same bags disappeared from the primary scan system. Not physically missing in view of the cameras but absent FIS. Roam the digital chain of custody. The scanner feed showed a clean break in routing confirmation. No loading confirmation, no customs handoff, just a gap where verified progression should have been. This was the pattern investigators had been searching for. As the night progressed, additional surveillance layers confirmed a deeper structure. Marcus was not acting randomly. He was timing movements around staffing transitions, specifically during short windows when conveyor zones were briefly unattended due to shift rotations. During those moments, maintenance corridors became lightly supervised, with only intermittent patrol coverage. At approximately 1:03 a.m., footage captured Marcus entering a restricted maintenance access point carrying a standard airport utility cart. The camera angle was partially obstructed by overhead piping. A known blind spot flagged in earlier audit reports but never corrected due to budget delays. Inside the footage, his movements were controlled, measured. I did not rush. He checked both directions before entering the corridor, then disappeared into the service passage that connected to auxiliary storage units used for temporary equipment staging. Simultaneously, investigators began pulling supplementary evidence streams. Storage facility records showed multiple short-term locker rentals registered under variations of employee identifiers linked indirectly to Marcus's access credentials. The rentals were paid in cash increments under thresholds that avoided automatic financial reporting triggers. Nothing directly illegal on its own, but the pattern raised immediate concern. At the same time, a digital forensic analyst flagged encrypted messaging traffic traced to a device pinging near Marcus's shift zones. The messages were not fully decrypted yet, but metadata indicated repeated short bursts of communication aligned precisely with high-value baggage routing windows. Another analyst flagged resale activity on online luxury marketplaces. Accounts had recently listed handbags matching serial ranges reported missing from airport logs. Listings appeared sporadic, often deleted within hours. IP traces were inconsistent, but several login attempts originated from network zones overlapping with airport employee Wi-Fi infrastructure. The investigation tightened further when parking garage surveillance was reviewed. One camera positioned above Terminal C employee parking recorded Marcus exiting the facility after overnight shifts, occasionally carrying sealed containers that did not match standard airport-issued equipment. The footage was grainy, or partially obstructed by structural beams, but timestamps aligned with known disappearance windows. By this stage, a federal involvement was no longer optional. When total estimated losses surpassed $600,000 in insured luxury goods, Homeland Security investigations formally joined the case. The escalation shifted the tone inside the command center immediately. Paper fire. These were replaced with consolidated digital caseboards. Access was restricted to a smaller clearance group. Conversations became quieter, more precise, and far more cautious. Despite the growing pressure, Marcus's public behavior remained unchanged. Colleagues still described him as calm, almost detached from the rising tension inside the baggage division. When supervisors increased spot checks and conducted unannounced badge audits, Marcus complied without hesitation. No visible panic. No defensive escalation. Just controlled responses and quiet acknowledgement of procedures. But internally, our airport executives were under increasing strain. The possibility of media exposure was no longer theoretical. Insurance carriers had begun requesting formal incident summaries. Legal advisors were warning about liability exposure tied to security infrastructure failures. Meetings were held behind closed doors in administrative offices where blinds remained permanently drawn. Then came the surveil. Night that shifted everything. At 2:41 a.m., monitors in the command room captured Marcus pushing a black hard-shell suitcase onto a utility cart near the edge of a restricted corridor. The suitcase matched the profile of multiple missing luxury baggage reports. He paused at the entrance of a maintenance hallway rarely used during active operations, glanced toward the main terminal access point, then entered. Inside the corridor, camera feed showed limited visibility. The angle narrowed as he moved deeper into the service passage, or lighting dropped and acoustic echo increased from ventilation ducts overhead. His movement was steady but deliberate. Controlled. At 2:44 a.m., the suitcase disappeared from confirmed visual tracking. At 2:45 a.m., a corresponding baggage entry record vanished from the airport's live routing system. Not delayed. Not rerouted. Deleted from active tracking confirmation. Inside the operations room, no one spoke for several seconds. Only the soft tapping of keyboards filled the silence as analysts attempted to reconcile live footage with system logs that no longer matched. That single discrepancy became the focal point of the entire case. Within hours, investigators initiated coordinated warrant preparations. Storage units linked to flagged rental activity were identified for immediate search. Financial tracking teams prepared seizure orders for suspected proceeds. Federal agents drafted arrest documentation supported by consolidated surveillance logs, badge access records, and digital trace analysis. Airport police units were placed on standby for early morning deployment. And as briefing folders were finalized under the dim glow of terminal side office lighting, one detail stood out above everything else. The system had not just recorded possible theft, it had recorded precision. But when agents opened the storage units connected to Marcus Reed, they discovered far more than missing luggage. The federal raid began just before sunrise, when the airport perimeter was still wrapped in a low gray haze and most of the city's traffic hadn't yet picked up. Unmarked vehicles rolled into position across 3 separate locations at once: Marcus Reed's apartment complex on the outskirts of Clayton County, a mid-sized storage facility near Old National Highway, and a parking structure adjacent to Terminal C where he routinely ended his overnight shifts. Inside Marcus's apartment building, residents on the 3rd and 4th floors were woken by sharp knocks followed by the controlled fours of entry protocols. White Homeland Security agents moved through the hallway with measured urgency, their radios crackling softly with coordinated updates from the other teams. A maintenance worker standing near the stairwell later described the silence that followed the first door breach. No shouting, no chaos. Just procedural movement and the sound of gloves snapping into place. Marcus was located inside the apartment without resistance. He was seated near the kitchen table, still in casual clothing from the night shift, his airport ID resting beside a half-empty glass of water. According to incident logs, he did not attempt to flee or speak immediately. He simply looked toward the entry point, blinking slowly as agents identified themselves, and began reading search authorization paperwork under the sterile glow of portable entry lights. At the same time, 2 miles away, another federal unit entered the storage facility registered under multiple short-term rental agreements tied to cash payments and inconsistent identification records. The air inside was cold, metallic, filled with the faint smell of dust and aging concrete. Lockers were opened in sequence, each one documented by evidence technicians photographing contents before removal. What they found inside shifted the tone of the entire operation. Dozens of luxury handbags were stacked in unmarked containers, many still carrying airline baggage tags linked to international flights through Milan, Paris, and Dubai. Some bags were wrapped in plastic coverings. Others placed loosely in storage bins as if moved quickly between handling points. Designer receipts were scattered across multiple compartments, some partially burned or torn, as though someone had attempted to reduce traceability without fully destroying evidence. Passenger identification tags were recovered in bulk, organized loosely in envelopes without clear categorization. Airport luggage tracking stickers, some partially peeled, others intact, were found mixed with counterfeit shipping labels designed to obscure origin points. Alongside them were bundles of cash wrapped in rubber bands, stored inside sealed plastic containers placed toward the back of the unit. In a separate compartment, investigators cataloged luxury watches and electronic devices, all logged individually and photographed under standard evidence procedures. The quiet sound of camera shutters and handwritten notation filled the storage space as technicians moved methodically from one discovery to the next. Back at Marcus's apartment, the arrest procedure unfolded with minimal disruption. He was instructed to remain seated while agents conducted a full sweep of the residence. Neighbors gathered in the hallway and parking lot below, some holding phones up through partially opened windows, recording in silence. There was no confrontation, no visible escalation, only the steady rhythm of procedural verification: bags checked, drawers opened, electronics tagged and sealed. Marcus remained composed throughout. He answered basic identification questions with short, controlled responses. When asked about specific recovered items, he paused longer than expected, offering no immediate explanation. His expression remained steady. But observers later noted a subtle shift in posture: shoulders slightly lowered, hands resting still on the edge of the table as the search progressed room by room. Outside, by the time local media arrived, a thin line of yellow police tape had already been extended across the parking area. A news helicopter circled overhead, its rotor noise cutting through the morning quiet as early broadcast crews began transmitting live updates. Within hours, still images from airport surveillance systems, some blurred, others partially redacted, began circulating through national news outlets. Inside the airport administration building, panic was more controlled but no less urgent. Emergency meetings were held in a sealed conference room on the upper floor of Terminal B. White-gloved legal advisors reviewed liability exposure documents while airport executives initiated immediate suspension orders for multiple supervisors connected to baggage operations and maintenance oversight. Public statements were carefully worded. Officials emphasized isolated misconduct and ongoing cooperation with federal authorities, but internal memos painted a more complicated picture. Security OCLORs, maintenance delays, and ignored audit recommendations were already under review. As the investigation became public, victim interviews began surfacing across local and national broadcasts. Travelers described missing belongings that were never recovered, luxury handbags purchased during international trips, inherited items passed through families, and high-value personal effects that disappeared without explanation during airport transfers. The emotional tone of these interviews remained restrained, but the frustration was clear. Many expressed disbelief that such losses could occur inside a controlled airport system. Federal prosecutors soon confirmed what internal reports had already suggested. The alleged scheme tied to Marcus Reed may have operated for nearly 3 years without detection. The timeline stretched back further than initial estimates, suggesting systemic oversight gaps rather than isolated breaches. Online reaction escalated quickly. Social media platforms filled with discussions questioning airport security protocols, staffing shortages, and the effectiveness of internal monitoring systems. Analysts and commentators pointed to surveillance blind spots, delayed infrastructure upgrades, and inconsistent audit enforcement as contributing factors that allowed the pattern to continue unchecked. Despite the mounting public pressure, Marcus's court appearance the following day was quiet and procedural. Federal marshals escorted him into the courthouse through a secured side entrance beneath the parking structure, away from media access points. Inside the courtroom, fluorescent lighting reflected off polished wood benches as prosecutors outlined preliminary charges tied to theft, fraud, and interstate transportation of stolen goods. But what stood out most in the early proceedings was not just the evidence being presented, it was the language used by federal investigators. The case was no longer described as an isolated incident of theft. It was been treated as a potential networked operation involving multiple points of access within airport logistics systems. As Marcus sat motionless during the hearing, prosecutors made a brief but critical announcement. The investigation had expanded beyond a single suspect. Additional individuals connected to baggage handling, storage access, and logistical oversight were now under review. And as the judge ordered the next phase of federal inquiry to proceed under expanded jurisdiction, one final detail shifted the direction of the entire case. Then prosecutors revealed evidence suggesting Marcus may not have acted alone. The courtroom in the federal courthouse on North River Street was already packed long before the proceedings resumed that morning. The air inside carried a low, constant tension, broken only by the shuffle of paper, the hum of overhead ventilation, and the occasional click of a courtroom camera as federal media outlets documented every movement. Prosecutors began by laying a structured sequence of evidence that had taken months to assemble. Surveillance stills from airport loading bays, digital access logs pulled from TSA terminals, time-stamped baggage scans, and recovered airport inventory lists that now lined up with reported passenger losses stretching back nearly 3 years. Each piece was displayed on the courtroom monitors in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Prosecutors avoided exaggeration. They didn't need to. The timeline built itself. Bags scanned in at Terminal 4 for luxury international flights, then reappearing in maintenance corridor logs moments later, then disappearing entirely from the system. The prosecutor, a white federal attorney with a calm, clipped tone, pointed to the correlation between Marcus Reed's overnight shifts and every major spike in missing luxury baggage reports. The defense team responded immediately, attempting to fracture the chain of certainty. They challenged the integrity of the access logs, arguing that airport security systems were outdated and vulnerable to unauthorized duplication. They pointed to gaps in surveillance coverage near baggage elevators and maintenance corridors, emphasizing that multiple employees had shared access credentials due to staffing shortages. That the defense narrative stayed consistent, the system itself was compromised, and Marcus Reed, a black airport employee, was being positioned as a convenient focal point to shield upper management from liability and civil lawsuits. Then the testimony shifted toward the victims. A woman from Houston described losing a set of inherited diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, last scanned at baggage intake before vanishing at the airport. A businessman from Chicago testified about missing luxury watches worth over $40,000, purchased during a family trip to Zurich. Their voices remained controlled, but the emotional weight was visible in small pauses, tightened jaws, and the way they avoided looking directly at the defense table. The courtroom stayed silent except for the faint scratching of pens and the distant hum of air conditioning. Airport employees were called next. A maintenance supervisor from Terminal 2 described repeated warnings about malfunctioning security cameras near restricted corridors that were logged but never repaired. Another baggage handler testified that certain access doors had stopped locking properly months before the investigation began, allowing unrestricted movement between loading zones and service tunnels. Each testimony added another layer of institutional failure, revealing a system stretched thin by cost-cutting decisions ignored maintenance reports, and supervisors who prioritized efficiency over compliance. Throughout all of it, Marcus Reed remained almost motionless at the defense table. A black man in his mid-30s, dressed in a simple dark suit. He showed little outward reaction. His gaze rarely lifted to the monitors. When he did speak quietly with his attorney, it was brief, restrained, and controlled, often followed by long periods of silence, where he simply watched the prosecution's evidence unfold without visible response. Observers noted his calmness, but it was unclear whether it reflected confidence, resignation, or exhaustion from months of public scrutiny. The prosecution then introduced financial records that shifted the tone of the courtroom again. Bank statements showed multiple cash deposits inconsistent with Marcus Reed's airport salary of approximately $52,000 annually. Surveillance of retail transactions revealed purchases of high-end watches, electronics, and designer goods over a period of 18 months. He simply placed the documents side by side with airport shift records, allowing the overlap to speak for itself. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom grew heavier. Reporters outside the courthouse broadcast live updates, and aerial footage from news helicopters occasionally flickered across the screens in the courtroom feed, showing the growing national attention. Airport executives, though not defendants in the case, were mentioned repeatedly in testimony and cross-examinations, with internal failures becoming impossible to separate from the alleged thefts. The narrative had expanded beyond one employee into a system under strain, where accountability had repeatedly broken down. By the time the final statements were delivered, the jury box was visibly still. No one moved as the judge instructed them to begin deliberations. The 12 jurors filed out through a side door under the watch of marshals, carrying weeks of testimony, conflicting arguments, and thousands of pages of evidence into a closed room. Outside, the media continued to speculate, replaying surveillance images and financial charts that had now become nationally recognized. Marcus Reed was escorted out briefly, his expression unchanged as he passed through the courtroom doors flanked by federal officers. Cameras captured everything, though he offered nothing in return. No statements, no reaction, just a steady walk through the corridor as the case shifted fully into the hands of the jury. But the final outcome would leave both airport officials and investigators facing questions of their own. The sentencing hearing took place in the same federal courthouse on North River Street, but the atmosphere had shifted. The tension of trial had been replaced with a quieter, heavier silence. Rows of reporters lined the back wall, cameras ready but restrained under strict court orders. Marcus Reed, a black man now standing at the center of a completed federal conviction, sat between his attorneys with his hands folded, expression steady, almost unreadable. The judge reviewed the case in a measured tone, referencing the jury's guilty verdict on multiple counts of federal theft, wire fraud, and interstate transportation of stolen property. The evidence had already been established over weeks of testimony, surveillance footage from baggage corridors, airport access logs tied directly to his employee badge, financial records showing unexplained cash deposits alongside luxury purchases that far exceeded his reported salary. There was no dispute left in the record. Only sentencing remained. When victim impact statements were read, the courtroom shifted again. A woman from Atlanta spoke quietly about losing jewelry purchased for her daughter's wedding, items never recovered after disappearing during international transit at the airport. A retired teacher from Boston described the emotional violation of losing family heirlooms entrusted to airline luggage systems that were supposed to guarantee security. Their voices did not rise. They didn't need to. The damage had already been documented in financial terms. But in the courtroom it became something more personal, more human, harder to reduce to numbers. Federal prosecutors then outlined the sentencing recommendations. They described a pattern of theft spanning nearly 3 years, with losses exceeding hundreds of thousands of dollars. They requested significant prison time in a federal correctional facility, full asset forfeiture, and restitution orders that would attempt, but not fully succeed, in compensating victims. A confiscated property linked to Marcus Reed was already cataloged by federal agents, luxury goods, electronic devices, and financial assets tied to the investigation now held in evidence storage downtown. Marcus showed little reaction as the sentence was read. His posture remained controlled. Occasionally, he leaned slightly toward his attorney, exchanging brief, quiet remarks. His eyes rarely met anyone in the courtroom, often fixed on the table or the edge of the judge's bench. Observers later noted that his composure did not break, even as the judge outlined years in federal custody followed by supervised release conduct, aliens, and permanent disqualification from airport security employment. Outside the courtroom, the consequences were already expanding beyond Marcus himself. Internal airport documents, later obtained through public records requests, revealed a wave of resignations among mid-level supervisors in the weeks following the verdict. The airport authority announced emergency security audits across multiple terminals. Surveillance systems were scheduled for immediate upgrades, replacing outdated cameras that had already been cited in internal reports years earlier but never prioritized for funding. Federal oversight agencies initiated broader compliance reviews, focusing not only on the airport in question, but on similar facilities nationwide. Employee screening procedures were tightened, with renewed emphasis on access control verification and real-time monitoring of restricted baggage corridors. Public relations teams worked continuously to contain reputational damage as national news outlets. Array played footage of missing luggage scans and security blind spots that had gone unaddressed for years. Internal investigations later confirmed what had been quietly documented long before the trial. Multiple warnings had existed in maintenance logs. Security reports and employee complaints, doors that failed to lock properly, cameras that had been flagged as non-functional, ports of unauthorized corridor access that were logged but not escalated. The system had not failed in a single moment. It had eroded gradually, all noticed in daily routine until the consequences became impossible to ignore. Former co-workers of Marcus Reed expressed a different kind of shock. Many described him as quiet, punctual, and professional, someone who followed procedure without drawing attention. That contrast between everyday perception and courtroom reality became part of the public discussion, not as an attempt to explain his actions, but as a reflection of how easily trust can form inside systems days. A hain to restrict access and accountability simultaneously. As the case closed, attention shifted away from the individual conviction and toward the structure that allowed it to happen. Investigators and analysts began framing the case less as an isolated crime and more as a systemic breakdown, a situation where oversight existed on paper but not in practice, where alerts were generated but not acted upon, where small failures accumulated until they created blind spots large enough for exploitation. The final moments of the sentencing hearing carried a quiet, reflective weight. The judge's ruling marked the end of one legal process, but not the end of the questions surrounding it, because beneath the recovered assets, the surveillance footage, and the financial records, a deeper issue remained unresolved, one that extended beyond Marcus Reed, beyond the courtroom, and into the structure of the institution itself. And by the time the airport finally noticed the pattern, hundreds of thousands of dollars had already vanished into the system.